The morning air was crisp as Caroline Levitt stepped out of the black SUV in front of the towering glass building of National News Network. She smoothed down her navy blue blazer and took a deep breath. This wasn't her first high-profile interview, but something about this one felt different. "Ready for today?" asked Tom, her media advisor, matching her brisk pace toward the revolving doors. "As ready as I'll ever be," Caroline replied with a confident smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had stayed up until 2 a.m., surrounded by papers spread across her hotel room floor. Economic reports, policy briefings, and news clippings formed a sea of information she had committed to memory. The security guard nodded in recognition as they passed through the lobby. "They're expecting you on the 14th floor," he said, gesturing toward the elevator bank where a young production assistant was already waiting. "Ms. Levitt, welcome to NNN," the assistant said, her voice both cheerful and nervous. "I'm Jenna. I'll be taking you to makeup and then to the studio." The elevator ride was quiet. Caroline scrolled through her phone, reviewing the key points one last time. Economic growth numbers, job creation statistics, infrastructure spending. Details. She knew Collins would try to find holes in her knowledge. "We've got about 40 minutes before you're on air," Jenna explained as they walked down a hallway lined with framed photographs of historic interviews and breaking news moments. "Hair and makeup first, then sound check." The makeup room was bright and smelled of hairspray. A stylist named David worked quickly, adding powder to reduce shine under the harsh studio lights. "Collins has been on a tear lately," he commented, casually while blending foundation. "Last week she had the energy secretary practically stuttering." Caroline just smiled. She knew the game. The makeup chair was not the place for policy discussions. "All set," David said after a final spray of setting mist. "Good luck out there." Tom was waiting outside with a fresh coffee. "Remember, if she tries to corner you on the Johnson Amendment, pivot to the broader economic impact. Don't get stuck defending specifics when the big picture is so strong." "I know, Tom. We've been over this." Caroline took a sip of the coffee. Perfect temperature, just how she liked it. As they approached the studio, Caroline could see through the glass walls that the crew was busy adjusting lights and testing camera angles. Caitlin Collins sat at the desk reviewing notes and speaking with her producer. Even from a distance, Caroline noted how Collins commanded the space around her. 10 minutes to air," called out a technician as Jenna guided Caroline through the studio door. The room felt colder than expected. Television studios were always kept cool to offset the heat from the lighting, but this felt almost deliberate. Caroline wondered if this was part of Collins' strategy, keep guests slightly uncomfortable. "Ms. Levitt, welcome," Collins said, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "Thank you for making time for us today." "Thanks for having me," Caroline replied with equal professionalism. Up close, she noticed Collins looked tired around the eyes despite flawless makeup. They had that in common, at least. Both had clearly been preparing late into the night. A sound technician approached. "If I could just clip this microphone to your lapel," he said, attaching the small black device. "Please say something so we can check levels." "Testing, 1, 2, 3, Caroline said clearly. "How's that?" "Perfect," replied the technician before hurrying off. The studio was now buzzing with pre-show energy. Camera operators adjusted their equipment while producers spoke rapidly into headsets. The floor director was reviewing the segment timing with Collins, who nodded occasionally while still looking through her notes. Tom gave Caroline one last reassuring nod before moving to the edge of the set where he could observe without being in the shot. Caroline took her seat across from Collins, adjusted her posture, and placed her hands comfortably on the desk. "We'll start with some softball questions about the new initiative," Collins said without looking up from her papers. "Then we'll move to the controversy about funding allocations. Standard format." Caroline knew better than to trust this outline. Collins was famous for her unexpected pivots, seeming to follow a conventional interview structure before suddenly diving into tough questions from unexpected angles. "Sounds good," Caroline replied simply, taking another sip of water from the glass provided. A large digital clock on the wall showed 2 minutes until they were live. The floor director stepped forward, raising his hand to signal they were getting close. 30 seconds, he announced. The studio lights brightened to their full intensity. Caroline blinked twice, adjusting to the glare. She could feel a drop of sweat forming at the back of her neck despite the cool air. 10 seconds, called the director. 5, 4. He continued the countdown with his fingers. Collins straightened. Her papers transformed her expression from serious concentration to warm welcome, and looked directly into the camera as the red light came on. Good morning and welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Caitlin Collins. Today we're joined by White House Deputy Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to discuss the administration's new economic package that's been making headlines. As Collins launched into her introduction, Caroline maintained her composed expression. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was racing, planning 3 moves ahead like a chess player. This wasn't just another interview. This was a duel with one of the sharpest journalists in the business, and millions of people were about to watch it unfold in real time. The bright red light of the camera stared at her like an unblinking eye, waiting for her first move. Let's start with the basics, Collins said, leaning slightly forward in her chair. The studio lights caught the highlights in her hair as she glanced down at her notes. This economic package is being called the most ambitious in a decade. Can you walk our viewers through the key points? The question was straightforward, exactly as expected. Caroline nodded and began her well-rehearsed response. The American Prosperity Initiative has 3 main pillars, she explained, her voice steady. First, we're investing $300 billion in infrastructure, roads, bridges, and digital networks. Second, there's the Manufacturing Incentive Program aimed at bringing key industries back to American soil. And third, the small business tax relief that will help local economies thrive. Collins nodded, jotting something down. The cameraman to the left shifted slightly, getting a better angle as Collins looked up again. Those numbers sound impressive, but critics are saying this is just repackaging of existing programs. How is this truly different from what we've seen before? Caroline had anticipated this. Tom had drilled her on it just last night. What makes this different is the integration, she replied, using her hands to emphasize key points. Previous administrations approached these issues separately. We're creating a comprehensive system where these elements work together. For example, the infrastructure spending directly connects to manufacturing zones, creating efficient supply chains. Ado, producer, whispered something to Tom at the edge of the set. He gave a slight nod in Caroline's direction. She was hitting the right notes. The next 15 minutes followed a similar pattern. Collins asked about job creation projections, environmental considerations, and budget impacts. Caroline delivered clear answers, occasionally referencing a specific success story or local project to make the massive numbers feel more real to viewers. During a brief pause while a technician adjusted Collins' microphone, Caroline took a sip of water. So far, the interview was going exactly as planned, almost too smoothly, which made her uneasy. Collins hadn't built her reputation on softball questions. Back in 30 seconds, the floor director announced. Collins glanced at her tablet, swiping to a different set of notes. Something in her expression changed, subtle but noticeable to someone who'd spent years reading people across negotiating tables. You okay with water? Collins asked casually. We can get coffee if you prefer. I'm fine, thank you, Caroline replied, recognizing the seemingly friendly gesture for what it was, an attempt to establish rapport before changing tactics. The red light on the camera blinked back on. Welcome back to our conversation with Deputy Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, Collins said to the camera before turning back. Before the break, we were discussing the administration's economic package. I'd like to shift gears slightly. Here it comes, Caroline thought. Last Tuesday, during the Midwest Economic Forum, your boss stated that previous administrations left the heartland behind. Yet records show similar funding patterns going back 3 administrations. Can you explain this apparent contradiction? The pivot was smooth but unmistakable. This wasn't about the new initiative anymore, it was about credibility. That's not quite what was said, Caroline replied calmly. The full quote referenced targeted investment in rural manufacturing communities, which has indeed been lacking. The funding patterns you mentioned were broadly distributed, but missed these specific areas. Collins tilted her head slightly. I have the transcript right here, she said, holding up her tablet. The exact words were, while past administrations talked about helping the heartland, they left these communities behind. That seems pretty explicit. Caroline didn't miss a beat. Context matters here. That statement came after discussing the closure of the Henderson manufacturing plant and similar facilities. When we talk about leaving behind, we're referring to those specific industrial sectors. A slight smile played at the corner of Collins's mouth, the kind that viewers might not notice but Caroline recognized as a hunter spotting prey. So when the president says heartland, he's not actually referring to the geographic heartland but specific sectors within it? Collins asked, her tone suggesting she was simply seeking clarification. He's referring to both, Caroline responded. The geographic regions that have been disproportionately affected by industrial downsizing. The data supports this. Manufacturing. Job losses in these regions outpaced national averages by 23% over the past decade. Collins nodded as if accepting this answer, made a note, then looked up again. Let me come back to the statement about previous administrations. The Henderson plant you mentioned closed during your administration's first year in office. How does that square with blaming previous leadership? Tom shifted his weight from one foot to another at the edge of the set. This was the trap, making Caroline either accept blame or appear to dodge responsibility. The Henderson closure was the result of policies set in motion years earlier, Caroline explained. Economic impacts often lag behind policy decisions. What matters now is our response, which includes the retooling grants that have already helped. Similar facilities in Ohio and Michigan. Collins leaned forward slightly. So just to be clear, when the president said previous administrations left the heartland behind, he was referring to policies whose impacts continued into your administration's term? The rephrasing was subtle but significant, making it sound like they were blaming others for their own problems. What we're saying, Caroline replied, maintaining eye contact, is that there's been a long-term pattern of neglect that we're finally addressing comprehensively. The American Prosperity Initiative represents the first coordinated approach to these interconnected challenges. Collins glanced down at her notes, then back up with renewed intensity. Let me ask again, because I think our viewers deserve a clear answer. Is the administration taking responsibility for economic conditions during its term, or placing the blame on previous administrations? The repetition was deliberate. Collins wanted to create a moment, either force Caroline to admit something, damaging, or make her appear evasive by refusing to give a direct answer. The studio seemed to grow quieter. Even the camera operators were perfectly still, sensing the tension. Caroline took a measured breath, aware that her response would likely become the clip shared online later. The game had definitely changed, and they were only 20 minutes in. Our administration is focused on solutions, not blame, Caroline replied, her voice calm but firm. What matters to Americans struggling in these communities isn't who created the problem, but who's fixing it. Collins didn't blink. That doesn't really answer the question, though, does it? Let me try again. When the president specifically said previous administrations left the heartland behind, was he accepting any responsibility for the current situation, or placing blame entirely elsewhere? In the control room, producers watched the exchange with growing interest. The director motioned to camera 2 for a tighter shot of Caroline's face. I think I've been clear, Caroline said, straightening almost imperceptibly in her chair. Economic challenges don't neatly follow election cycles. Our focus is on addressing problems that have been building for decades. Collins jotted something down, then looked up. So you're saying these problems have been building for decades, including during your administration's time in office? Tom shifted his weight at the edge of the set. This was the third time Collins had essentially asked the same question, each time slightly reworded. The strategy was obvious. Keep pushing until Caroline either contradicted herself or lost her composure. Every administration faces inherited challenges, Caroline said, keeping her tone measured. What distinguishes ours is that we're actually addressing the root causes, not just the symptoms. Collins tilted her head slightly. Let me approach this differently. The Henderson plant closed 18 months into your term. The Westlake facility announced layoffs just last quarter. Both are in what the president calls the heartland. How does that square with his criticism of previous administrations, the Breyer? Studio lights seemed to grow hotter. Caroline could feel a bead of sweat threatening to form at her temple but didn't raise her hand to wipe it away. Camera movements were minimal now, the operator sensing the tension. Those closures are precisely why this economic package is so urgent, Caroline responded. We're dealing with the consequences of decades of policies that hollowed out American manufacturing. The president's comments reflect that reality. Collins nodded as if considering this answer, then leaned forward slightly. But to be clear, those closures happened on your watch, correct? So when the president criticizes leaving the heartland behind, he's criticizing actions that continued during his own administration? Caroline took a small breath, recognizing the trap being set. This was now the fourth variation of essentially the same question. The repetition was deliberate, designed to frustrate her into either saying something regrettable or appearing evasive. We can't change the past, she said, deciding to shift the conversation. What we can do is implement solutions. That's why the American Prosperity Initiative includes specific provisions for communities like Henderson and Westlake. In the control room, the ratings monitor showed a spike in viewership. Viewers were tuning in, sensing the building tension. The producer whispered something to his assistant, who nodded and began making notes for promotional clips. Collins glanced down at her tablet, then back up with renewed intensity. I notice you're not directly addressing the question. One more. Time. Does the administration accept any responsibility for economic hardships that have occurred during its term? The repetition was now obvious to everyone watching. In the green room where other guests waited for their segments, people leaned closer to the monitor. One political consultant whispered to another, Collins is going for blood today. Caroline's expression remained calm. But something changed in her eyes, a subtle shift from defensive to strategic. Rather than answering directly, she took a different approach. Caitlin, this is now the 5th time you've asked essentially the same question, she said, her voice still pleasant but with an underlying firmness. I understand what you're trying to do, but our viewers deserve a more substantive conversation. A flash of surprise crossed Collins' face, quickly masked. Being called out directly wasn't part of her expected script. I'm simply trying to get a clear answer, Collins responded, her professional smile still in place. And I'm trying to provide context that your framing lacks, Caroline countered. The economic challenges facing the heartland aren't a simple matter of which administration did what. They're the result of global trends, technological changes, and yes, policy decisions made across multiple administrations. Collins started to speak, but Caroline continued, her rhythm unbroken. Let me share something specific that might help viewers understand. In Westlake, before the layoffs you mentioned, our administration implemented a worker retraining program that helped over 400 people transition to new roles. That's not mentioned in most coverage, but it's exactly the kind of proactive approach that distinguishes our policy. The director in the control room made a cutting motion with his hand, signaling to Collins that they needed to move on. They had other segments planned. Collins glanced at her producer's notes, then back to Caroline. That's an interesting point about Westlake, Collins said, changing tactics. But critics say these retraining programs often prepare workers for jobs that don't exist in their communities. How do you respond to that? The pivot was abrupt, but Caroline recognized it as a small victory. Collins had abandoned the repetitive questioning strategy. Those critics are looking at outdated models, Caroline explained, seizing the opportunity to move to firmer ground. Our approach partners directly with employers who've committed to hiring. In Westlake, for example, we worked with 3 regional manufacturers who needed skilled workers. Behind the cameras, Tom relaxed slightly. Caroline had weathered the most difficult part of the interview without losing her composure or falling into the trap of a soundbite that could be used against the administration. Collins nodded, making a note before looking up again. Let's talk about those manufacturers. Reports suggest they received substantial tax incentives to participate. Some would call that a corporate handout rather than a workforce solution. And just like that, they were back in contentious territory. But the dynamic had shifted. Caroline had demonstrated she wouldn't be rattled by repetitive questioning, and Collins had been forced to adjust her approach. The producer's voice came through Collins' earpiece, reminding her they needed to break for commercials in 30 seconds. "We'll have to leave that question for after the break," Collins said, turning to the camera. "We're speaking with Deputy Press Secretary Caroline Levitt about the administration's economic policies. Stay with us." As the red lights on the cameras blinked off, Collins took a sip of water. Across the desk, Caroline did the same, their eyes meeting briefly over the rims of their glasses. Neither woman spoke, but both understood that the interview had now entered a new phase, one where each recognized the other's strength. "And we're back with Deputy Press Secretary Caroline Levitt," Collins said as the cameras went live again. The brief commercial break had allowed both women to regroup. A makeup artist had hurried in during the last seconds to touch up Collins' forehead, while Caroline had declined the same offer with a small shake of her head. "Before the break, we were discussing the job retraining programs," Collins continued. "Let's return to the broader economic package. Your critics in Congress are saying this initiative would add nearly $1 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. How do you respond?" Caroline had expected this line of questioning. Budget concerns were always the go-to criticism for any major proposal. "Those projections ignore the revenue growth built into the plan," she explained. "Independent economists project that infrastructure investments alone will generate enough economic activity to offset nearly 40% of the costs. When you add in the manufacturing revival, the package largely pays for itself." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Largely pays for itself? That's quite a claim. The Congressional Budget Office hasn't supported that view. The CBO uses static scoring, models that don't fully account for economic growth factors," Caroline responded. "If you look at similar programs historically, they consistently outperform CBO projections." Collins flipped through her notes. "Let me quote the CBO director directly. Last Thursday, he said, 'No credible economic model shows this package paying for itself.'" "That seems pretty definitive." Caroline nodded. "I spoke with Director Hayes the day after that statement. What he meant was that it doesn't pay for itself in the traditional static scoring model, but he acknowledged that dynamic scoring shows a very different picture." Collins looked skeptical. "So you're saying the CBO director didn't mean what he clearly stated?" "I'm saying his full comments beyond that single quote provided important context," Caroline replied. "In fact, I have the transcript from that session right here." She reached into a folder that had been sitting on the table beside her and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a move she had prepared for this exact moment, having physical documentation ready rather than relying on memory or digital notes. Director Hayes continued, and I quote, "While standard projections don't show full cost recovery, alternative models incorporating higher growth multipliers from infrastructure investments suggest the gap could be substantially smaller than our headline figure." That's the full context. The studio went quiet. Collins looked momentarily taken aback. She hadn't expected Caroline to have the exact quote ready. The cameraman zoomed in slightly, capturing the subtle shift in the power dynamic. "Even accepting that context," Collins said, recovering quickly, "substantially smaller doesn't mean eliminated. So again, how do you justify adding to the deficit? The same way previous administrations justified tax cuts, defense spending, or emergency measures, by weighing short-term costs against long-term benefits," Caroline answered. "The difference is that our investments create tangible assets and jobs, not just paper wealth." Collins looked down at her tablet, then back up with renewed determination. "Let's get back to something you mentioned earlier. You claimed this package is the first coordinated approach to these economic challenges. Are you really suggesting that no previous administration attempted to address these issues in a coordinated way?" And there it was, the fifth variation of the same question circling back to the earlier line of attack. Collins was determined to get the soundbite she wanted. Tom, standing at the edge of the set, gave a small shake of his head. In the control room, producers leaned forward. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Would Caroline take the bait this time? Caroline set the paper down slowly. Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, but a calm resolve. She had prepared for this interview meticulously, but now she decided to go off script. "Caitlin," she began, her voice steady and conversational rather than defensive. "I think our viewers deserve better than watching you ask the same question for the 5th time, hoping I'll eventually slip and give you the controversial sound. Bite you're fishing for." A ripple of tension ran through the studio. The floor director froze, clipboard in hand. In the control room, the executive producer whispered, "Are we still live?" Though he knew they were. Collins blinked but maintained her composure. "I'm simply trying to get a clear answer to a straightforward question." "There's nothing straightforward about asking the same question 5 different ways, particularly when I've answered it each time," Caroline replied. Her tone wasn't confrontational but matter-of-fact. "Your viewers tune in because they want substance, not gotcha moments." Collins started to respond, but Caroline continued. "Let me address what I think you're really getting at. Yes, previous administrations had economic plans. Yes, some elements were similar to ours. The key difference isn't that we're the first to try, but that we're taking a fundamentally different approach to implementation." She pulled out another document from her folder. "Here's a comparison chart showing how our approach differs from the last 3 administrations. The integration of workforce development, infrastructure, and manufacturing incentives in the same regions is the innovation here. Previous efforts were siloed, with different departments often working at cross purposes." Collins glanced at the document, visibly recalibrating her approach. This wasn't going according to her plan. "Those are your administration's claims," she said, "but reports from the Economic Policy Institute suggest—" "I'm glad you mentioned the EPI," Caroline interjected, now fully in command of the conversation. "Their latest analysis released yesterday actually supports our approach. They specifically noted that the regional integration model represents a promising departure from previous disconnected efforts." She slid another paper across the desk. "Page 4, second paragraph. They're not typically supporters of our administration, so their endorsement carries extra weight." The camera caught Collins' momentary hesitation as she scanned the document. The director signaled for a wide shot, capturing both women at the desk. "It seems you came very prepared today," Collins said, attempting to regain her footing. "That's my job," Caroline replied simply. "Just as it's your job to ask tough questions, but tough doesn't have to mean repetitive." In the control room, ratings, numbers continued to climb. Social media monitoring showed the interview was now trending nationally. The executive producer spoke into his headset. "Stay with this. Don't cut away." Collins, recognizing that her usual strategy had been effectively countered, shifted to a more substantive approach. "Let's talk about implementation timelines then. Your documents make impressive claims, but how quickly will Americans actually see results from this package?" The conversation had moved beyond the trap of repetitive questioning to something more meaningful. Viewers watching at home could sense the change. This was no longer an attempt to trip someone up, but a genuine discussion of policy details. Caroline knew she had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of the interview. The turning point had come not from losing her temper, but from calmly calling out the tactic being used against her and redirecting to substance. "We're out of time," Collins said finally, glancing at the clock. "Thank you, Deputy Press Secretary Levitt, for joining us today." "Thank you for having me," Caroline replied, with a polite nod. The red lights on the cameras blinked off. The bustling studio, which had been unnaturally quiet during the tense exchange, suddenly erupted with activity. Sound technicians moved in to remove microphones while the next guest waited nervously in the wings. "Well, that was something," Collins said in a lower voice as she gathered her notes. Her expression was professional, but there was a hint of begrudging respect in her eyes. "Always happy to have a substantive conversation," Caroline replied, matching Collins's tone. They weren't friends, but they were professionals who understood the game they both played. As Caroline stood up, Tom approached from the edge of the set, trying to hide his smile. "Car's ready whenever you are," he said simply, though his eyes conveyed much more. The floor director approached Collins with schedule changes for the next segment, and Caroline took the opportunity to leave the set without further conversation. As they walked down the studio hallway, the production assistant, Jenna, hurried alongside them. "That was amazing," she whispered, then quickly composed herself. "I mean, your car's waiting at the south entrance." Tom chuckled as they continued walking. "Save the reviews until we're out of the building," he murmured. But it was already clear that something significant had happened. Staff members glanced up from their work as Caroline passed, expressions ranging from surprise to admiration. A security guard at the elevator gave her a subtle nod of approval. In the lobby, the receptionist looked up from her computer. "Phone's been ringing nonstop since your segment," she said. "Lots of interview requests coming in." "Thank you," Caroline replied, maintaining her composed demeanor until they pushed through the revolving doors into the bright midday sun. The black SUV waited as promised. Once inside with the doors closed, Tom finally let out a long breath. "Well," he said, grinning now, "that wasn't exactly how we planned it." Caroline allowed herself to relax for the first time in hours, leaning back against the leather seat. "No, it wasn't. When you pulled out those documents—" Tom shook his head in admiration. Her face was priceless. "I almost didn't bring them," Caroline admitted. "I thought it might seem too confrontational." "It was perfect timing," Tom said as the driver pulled away from the curb. "The way you waited until she'd backed herself into a corner with the repetitive questioning." Caroline's phone buzzed, then again, and again. The screen lit up with notifications faster than she could read them. "It's starting," Tom said, glancing at his own phone. "Clips are already going viral. Leave It Destroys Collins is trending." Caroline scrolled through the messages. Colleagues, journalists, even a few political opponents were reaching out. The White House communications director had sent a simple text. "Call me ASAP. Well done." "Look at this," Tom said, turning his phone to show her. Someone had already created a compilation video of Collins asking the same question 5 different ways, followed by Caroline's calm takedown. The view count was climbing by the thousands. "This isn't how it's supposed to work," Caroline said with a tired smile. "Policy should be the story, not personality clashes. Sometimes you need one to get people to pay attention to the other," Tom replied. Back at the network, the aftermath was just beginning. In the executive suite, the network president watched the replays with the senior producer. "We're getting requests to license the clip from every major outlet," the producer said. "Social media engagement is through the roof." "Collins won't be happy," the president noted. "She'll be fine. Her ratings will benefit too." The producer paused the video on a frame showing both women at the moment Caroline had called out the repetitive questioning. "This is good television, whatever side you're on." In the editing room, young staffers were already cutting segments for the evening news and digital platforms. "Start with the 5th question, then go back to show the previous 4, directed the senior editor. Then cut to her response, "Keep it tight." A junior editor looked up from his screen. "Should we include the part where Levitt calls out the questioning strategy? Some are saying it was disrespectful." "Include everything," the senior editor replied. "Let the viewers decide. That's what they're all talking about anyway." By late afternoon, the story had evolved beyond the network's control. Political analysts on competing channels were dissecting the exchange. Radio talk shows devoted entire segments to it. Social media exploded with memes and reaction videos. At a small diner in Ohio, patrons watched the replay on the television above the counter. "That's how you handle these media types," said an older man, nodding in approval as he sipped his coffee. "Straight to the point, no nonsense." "I don't agree with her politics," the woman next to him replied, "but I respect how she handled herself. Didn't lose her cool, just called out the game being played." Similar conversations were happening across the country. What might have been just another political interview had become a cultural moment, a rare instance where substance had prevailed over sound bites. In her office that evening, Caroline finally had a moment to process the day's events. The stack of briefing papers for tomorrow waited on her desk, but she allowed herself a brief pause to reflect. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Mom's driving everyone crazy replaying your interview. Call when you can. So proud of you." Caroline smiled, then turned to the window. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the buildings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new attempts to trip her up or twist her words. The cycle would continue. But something had changed today. Not just for her personally, but in the dynamic between press and officials. For a brief moment, the substance of policy had overshadowed the game of political theater. Whether that change would last remained to be seen, but it was a start. Her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but the communications team is waiting for your input on tomorrow's strategy. They're thinking we should lean into today's momentum." Caroline nodded, turning away from the window. "Tell them I'll be right there." The aftermath would continue to unfold in ways she couldn't predict. Clips would be replayed, analyses would be written, and the interview would become a case study in media training sessions for years to come. But right now, there was still work to do. The spotlight came with responsibility, and she intended to use it to focus attention where it belonged. On the policies that would actually affect people's lives, not on the political theater that too often obscured them.